Now he's successful in Senegal, and then he was successful in Ghana. If you are to help the countries, you have to go through the structure, a government. You cannot give aid or financial assistance to people who are not credible, like Dr. Owusu addressed. The case you addressed in Liberia, I served in the army in Okomok. I was in Liberia, I was in Sierra Leone, in the UN. I know what's happened there. But you have to address too, if the World Bank give a credit to a country, you have some standard you have to follow. You have to some standard you have to be in. It's a credibility. If you don't, your credit may be lowest. What are you thinking about now that China coming to Africa? Now there are a lot of China activity going in Africa. They give a credit to dictator without any, they know that you're a dictator, they don't care about that. They will just give you without any credibility. So I just want you to address what are you thinking about that? Because of there's something they follow some kind of guidance. But the Chinese are not following guidance. And follows all the dictators in Africa.
Well, first of all, I want to dissuade you from the belief that it is only China that is going to fund the dictators in Africa. I actually think that China is not very different from the USA, from Britain, from France, from any other African country. France has propped up the worst tin-pot dictators on the west coast of Africa, in Gabon, in Cameroon, in Ivory Coast, everywhere. The United States, for many years, financed Mobutu, they financed Siad Barre. The worst dictators, Samuel Doe in Liberia, for example, was a prop of the Americans. So, personally, I actually think that the belief by Africans that somebody else is going to come and save them is the worst disease on that continent. Africans need to believe that our destiny lies entirely in our hands, and the solutions for that continent will come from our hands. And they will come from us changing the ways we govern ourselves, the way we think, the way we do our work. It will not come from external generosity. Western pity can never help Africa. So, right now, I actually think that Museveni is as worse a dictator as any dictator can come, and the Americans are propping him up. They give him money every year. The World Bank showers him with money. While 2 million of his citizens live in concentration camps akin to those of the Nazis. You think the Americans do not know? The Americans who give Uganda military assistance and the British defend it at the UN are clearly aware that you have a government committing a genocide against its own people and the government keeping its 2 million of its own citizens in concentration camps. Reproducing Nazi Germany in Uganda in 2007, financed by Western governments. So for me, China and every external actor is not different. And it would be wrong for us to assume that the Americans will be better than the Chinese. All countries seek their interests. Nations pursue their national interests. And in pursuit of that interest, they exploit internal coherences or incoherences to achieve their goals. Because remember that the Americans financed the dictator called Suharto of Indonesia. They financed Park Chung-hee in South Korea. They financed the Kuomintang or the Guomindang in the KMT in Taiwan. These nations, in spite of that, they used the alliance with the Americans productively, and they developed. The Americans, the same Americans financed Siad Barre in Somalia. They financed Mobutu Sese Seko in Congo, Zaire. They financed Samuel Doe in Liberia. What happened in Africa? Disaster, state collapse and economic collapse. So bottom line is that it is your internal capacity that makes possible for you to exploit external opportunities. The internal capacity in Liberia, Somalia, and Zaire was lacking. So the relationship between the US and the government of Mobutu produced economic and social disaster. But there was internal capacity in South Korea. There was internal capacity in Taiwan, which allowed the interaction of this relationship to be productive. So the problem primarily is internal to Africa, how it can organize itself. And for me, the request is the best way to help that continent is to actually not help it at all. The best thing you can do for Africa is to do nothing at all for it. That is the beginning point, because then you will pump some bit of sense into both the elites who organize the coalition of rule and the societies around them. Yes, sir.
Robert Mazur, sociologist. Could you comment about civil society, both in Uganda and more generally, and while there are many weaknesses, could you talk about some of the positive examples that you see that might lead to more democratic practice and more empowerment in the way that you're talking about?
The greatest strength Africa has is it has highly talented people. I went to school in Uganda. I went to the best schools in Uganda and went to Makerere University. It was the melting pot of all the nation's talent of my age. From there, we went to the best schools in the world: Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Cambridge, Oxford. I can tell you, MBAs, PhDs in bioengineering and solid mechanics and whatever you can think of. All these people have never gone back to that continent. Why? Because the rulers there do not see value in their most talented and skilled citizens. And if they are to see value, we need to induce them to see value. And the way we can induce that is, one, to deny them resources from abroad so that they find value in their own citizens. That is one. The second is the private sector. Africans are incredibly entrepreneurial. No one here can ever know of it because there is so much pedestrian writing. One of the men I admire most in the academia was Lord P.T. Bauer. I don't know whether anyone of you has read him. Lord P.T. Bauer writes about minorities in Africa, the Lebanese in West Africa and the Indians in East Africa, as having been successful entrepreneurs. But he thought that the Africans were not good entrepreneurs. And P.T. Bauer, and then that is what shocked me about his very brilliant analysis of many of the problems of Africa. The colonial state in Africa was not an open access system. You never became a merchant because you competed in the marketplace. The colonial state created a law saying the African will be a farmer, the Indian will be a trader, the European will be an industrialist. So the structure of the economy was determined, your position in the market, your position in the economic structure was not determined by market forces, it was always determined by state legislation. So at the time of independence, the Asians controlled all the trade, the European companies controlled the trade, and they rather controlled the industries, and the Africans were farmers. So the entrepreneurial class that emerged was racially defined by legislation, not by market forces. So for me, the most important thing in Africa is to create open access systems. Governments in Africa do not like their own citizens to grow rich. I can promise you that. Go to an African country. The first thing they do is they create a structure, an economic policy framework that is actually hostile to business. But they create individual exceptions. For example, investors may lack access to affordable credit. There may be no institution, therefore, from which you can access affordable credit. They may lack access to land. The tax rates may be very high. The roads the transportation may be very expensive. But although the overall business environment is bad and therefore tends to inflict collective harm on business as a whole, they create individual exceptions. For a visit to the State House, to talk to the president, and in exchange for a bribe, you can get access to cheap credit. You can get a subsidy on your transport cost to the cost. Equally, you can get a tax rebate. In other words, by closing the business opportunity for everybody to compete, and only opening windows where only those who visit the president are able to succeed in business, then you harm business collectively, while at the same time you are cultivating a private sector constituency to act as a source of financial support for you. So the structure of the economy, the business and policy environment in Africa is anti-private enterprise development. Now, the African rulers know that if you allow Africans themselves, if you create an open access system and every African becomes rich, then they will employ their economic resources politically. But if you only leave this window for Asian businessmen, a few European firms, African rulers know that if you're a white person or an Indian, your racial alienness denies you the necessary social ties with the surrounding society for you to be able to organize a mass political base. So, because you cannot organize politically, if you suffer an economic policy disagreement with the regime, you cannot transform an economic policy disagreement into a political disagreement. Because, as I have said, your racial alienness denies you the right ties, the necessary ties you need to organize politically against the sitting government. I have seen emerging African entrepreneurs be destroyed, all in the name of ensuring that you do not put resources into the hands of those who may use them politically against you. So, do I see hope in Africa? Yes. We have a vibrant, talented professional class. Men are still in Africa, but men have left. We have entrepreneurs who are teeming to come up, but the policy environment stifles them. And immediately we make money, the tax collector comes, and then they impose a bill on you, and the next day you're bankrupt. Yes, sir.
The things you've said about, especially saying that money should not be given to African governments and Africans in general, because the money goes to waste. It's unfortunate, because I'm going to draw an example before I move on to the general. A couple of years ago when I was still in Nigeria, one of the president at the time took an IMF loan, and he used the money, split up the money and gave it to individual investors, and college graduates were given money to start businesses. And as of today, most of the people that started their businesses back then are very successful entrepreneurs. That money came from outside. The health sector today in a lot of countries are not doing too well. If the money is not coming from outside and there's no money locally, how do the people survive? There are a lot of orphans, a lot of people who are hungry. I'm not saying that Africans cannot do it, but I believe that everybody needs help, one way or the other. And instead of help should not come from outside at all, I believe that if this help is channeled in a way that it comes with technological assistance in addition to financial assistance, it can be very, very helpful. And I'll give you another example. For instance, Iowa State University has the Department of Biosystems Engineering, Agricultural and Biosystems Engineering. Basically, they train engineers and technologies to farm and create machines and stuff like that. One thing that happens is a lot of times the money that's sent to Africa, say for agricultural purposes, the machines that are sent over there, the people there cannot operate them. The technological know-how to fix them are not there. And we had a conference the other day, and I was just telling them that there are a lot of machines that can be used if they are the right size and people are trained to use them. We can produce them over there and also use them over there. And things can work. Africa is like anywhere else. There are a lot of things that don't work, and there are a lot of things that work. And again, I'm going to take you back to the history of the United States when it first started. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of child labor. But today, the United States is a great country. We all look up to the United States. We all live over here. We make contributions over here. And Bill Gates is just one person. He made a world of difference here and abroad. And I think one person or several of us here can do that. And it doesn't mean that you have to leave here, abandon where you live, and move to Africa to be able to do that. And a lot of people over here, the average Americans, are doing things to help Africa. So why can't Africans do it? Why can't Africans share the resources that are coming from here into the right places over there so things can work, instead of saying, don't send it over there. So I don't think it's the right way to go.
Well, I think that you have actually understood my argument. I'm not saying that African countries should not borrow. I'm simply saying they should not be given aid. Aid is a gift. It's an instrument of charity. If a government wants to borrow and it has an economically viable project, let it go to the market. If you have destroyed your credibility, you see, governments in Africa borrow from the World Bank and IMF because they have so terribly mismanaged their economies that they cannot be trusted on international financial markets. In other words, by creating a system called World Bank IMF aid, you are really creating incentives for governments to misbehave. You want to borrow? The government of Botswana goes and borrows on the market every time, doesn't it? So have economically viable projects and borrow to finance viable projects, and the market can pay for it. You see, if you, I don't know how many of you have done business, possibly because they come from the private sector. You see, if you have a project that has high economic returns, international financial markets will be willing to finance it. The existence of the IMF and World Bank is a travesty of the development process as we know it historically. Because a government that has no viable projects that can bring about qualitative change is now given access to credit, then it borrows to finance consumption. In fact, the Nigerian guy who asked me has just left because I wanted to give him figures on Nigeria. Between 1974 and 1997, rather between 1974 and 2004, that is 30 years, $500 billion was stolen out of Nigeria. $500 billion was stolen out of Nigeria. That is that is almost the same amount of money Africa received as aid from 1960 to 97. Now, ask yourself, why does Nigeria need World Bank money to give to entrepreneurs? Nigeria has a lot of money from oil. Its own politicians are stealing it and banking it abroad. Secondly, $60 billion worth of Nigerian wealth is held by Nigerians abroad. The government should find it in its interest of Nigeria to attract this capital back home. It should put in place the right policy and institutional incentives for Nigerians who own a lot of wealth abroad to bring it back home. And finally, the government of Obasanjo. It pushed these governments of Switzerland, they harassed the Swiss, saying, oh, Abacha stole money, we want to recover it. They recovered $928 million. $928 million. In July 2007, the Nigerian Senate did an audit of that recovered money in the central bank. You know how much they found in the central bank? Give me a wild guess. $12 million. What had happened to the 916 million? Under the democratic government of Obasanjo. So why go to the World Bank for money? Why should Nigeria go to the IMF for money, really? In other words, I'm saying there is no way, for as long as we have IMF and World Bank willing to subsidize corruption in Africa, you can never have governments in Africa think of how best to tap their own people's talent. This is the travesty I'm talking about. Yes, also.
Well, let me just put some historical facts here. If you look at U.S. foreign aid to South Korea, South Korea was able to achieve economic success because of the U.S. foreign aid, which freed South Korea to go out into the private sector and was able to borrow money at a very good rate. In other words, because the U.S. government aid to South Korea was helping the South Korean government, the South Korean government was able to go out into the private sector and borrow money for productive investment. In other words, the foreign aid to South Korea complemented whatever came in from the private sector, and that is what caused economic development in South Korea. I do agree with you. I mean,
so question, what happened to Nigeria? Rather, what happened to Zaire? What happened to Zaire and Somalia?
Well, I mean,
and Liberia?
What I'm talking about, and this is what I'm talking about, the differences in Africa. Nigeria is a worst case of corruption. That does not mean that, African governments, and again, your issue of leadership and vision, that does not mean that African governments cannot take advantage of the opportunities that are available in the international community. Now, I think what is happening here is the new way of looking at African problems as essentially caused by domestic factors. That is true, but we don't also have to downplay the importance of the fact that Ghanaian farmers are producing more cocoa, they're receiving more in terms of income. We don't have to underestimate the effect of the external factors that work against African governments. We are in a global economy. African governments to succeed, they have to learn and participate in the global economy, take advantage of the incentives in the global economy, and use it to their advantage. I think that is where the future is. The future is for the African government to learn how to use this foreign aid and other opportunities in the global economy and use it to their advantage, not to cancel it completely.
Well, if you are still talking foreign aid or borrowing money from financial markets, I think that it's important for governments in Africa to borrow from financial markets, but it is dangerous if they have to get foreign aid. Why get aid? I just really want to understand the rationale for it. You see, aid comes in the following forms. One, it comes as concessionary loans, which are 0.78% per year from the World Bank. Aid also comes in the form of grants. I personally think that those grants are very bad for Africa. In fact, Africa is backward because of those grants, because of that international charity. Because you see, if governments in Africa had no access to these grants, for me it is like common sense. If they had no access to cheap money from the World Bank pays for governments that are hopeless, corrupt, incompetent, unproductive. If they had to go to financial markets, they would be forced to borrow, they would be forced to present economically viable projects. They cannot borrow to finance consumption. They cannot borrow to easily finance wars. You must demonstrate to a bank that you are capable of repaying. The problem with the World Bank and bilateral aid is that you borrow, you misuse the loan, you fail to pay, and Mr. Tony Blair says you have debt relief. I am totally opposed to debt relief. If you borrowed money, you misused it, please pay it. If you can't pay it, you default. If you default, good heavens, pay the price of default. You know the price of default? You get blacklisted in international financial markets. You are declared bankrupt and you are incapable of borrowing. But the idea that government A borrows, the politicians steal the money, and then the international community forgives them, you create a problem of moral hazard, because the countries that borrow and use their loans very well now will be encouraged not to use their loans well. Let's look at the morality of it. A government like that of Botswana or Mauritius, it borrows, uses the loan very well. The politicians don't steal it. They use it productively and they pay back. Uganda borrows, the politicians steal it. And then you come and say, we are forgiving Uganda. What are you telling Botswana? You are rewarding the thieves and penalizing the good managers of loans. And therefore, you are creating a moral hazard whereby now the guys who are borrowing and using their loans well realize that there is no penalty for misusing the loans, but there is a reward for it, and it's called debt relief. The entire economic system of the world has been turned upside down by the international aid system. That system must end for poor countries to get a chance to develop. Unless, by the way, I should tell you about South Korea. South Korea, if you look at it critically, it faced strong existential threats. North Korea had overrun it at one time, and it is only UN troops that helped it regain its sovereignty. So, confronting a big threat at the 38th parallel, the state in South Korea had to develop a chemical industry, for example, to build harbors to ensure that it builds a strong military. The strong military to defend itself required a strong economy, and that's why it developed. There was an external threat that allowed it to use foreign resources productively. The same applies to Taiwan. The Kuomintang were facing a threat from mainland China. I have told you about Rwanda. Rwanda faces a serious existential threat. This is not just a strategic threat, it's an existential threat. The Tutsi can be wiped out tomorrow if they lose power, so they must think creatively. For most governments in Africa, their sovereignty is underwritten by the international system, and therefore they have no threats to force them to work harder. Yes, sir. Mr. Msema Kweri.
Thank you. Actually, from your presentation...
Can you give me 2 minutes? I just want to make an announcement that we'll allow two last questions or comments. Then after that, we'll ask the advisor for the for the African Student Association to say the last word. And we ask all African students to meet at Bouvis Place after this presentation. But after the last the last word by the advisor, we can have interaction, but that will be after the time that we'll give the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Mwenda. From your presentation, now I'm getting heated. What is the rationale of foreign aid? World Bank is taking a lot of money to Uganda. I grew up in Uganda. I'm one of the persons who have probably depended on foreign aid, good or bad, especially corn from Iowa, maybe. But then the problem is, if Uganda is missing this foreign aid, and World Bank continues to pay, is it out of love? You talked about education, that this world needs educated people to manage the economy. Why are these educated people from World Bank still pay this money to people who are actually thieves? That's what you mentioned. And I agree with you, I've lived in Uganda and several other places. So why is it out of love, or why are they paying this money?
Well, you see, the World Bank, first of all, exists because there has to be bad governments to lend. If there are only good governments, it can't exist. But two, I want you to take an example of an ordinary World Bank bureaucrat. You see, if you look at the structure of the World Bank, you are promoted on your ability to lend, not on your ability to refuse to lend. So if you are the World Bank desk officer for Uganda, your performance is judged by how many projects you are able to fund, not by how many projects you are able to refuse to fund. So the structure of incentives within these organizations favors the continuation of lending even in the face of failure. Now, if you are managing a World Bank project, you don't get promoted by reporting that the project fails. So you get promoted by reporting that the project is succeeding. You see, that is another problem. The third is the World Bank itself is funded by people who are citizens of countries that are developed and therefore are accountable. If the World Bank is not achieving much, you can look here. When I worked as an intern at the Senate, and I worked in the office of a man called Phil Graham. Phil Graham was the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. Then I interned in the office of Jesse Helms. He was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Many people here don't like those guys, especially people on the left leaning. I tell you, I admired them so much because they were very clear on these things of aid. They wanted it ended. And I felt so proud that I ever worked with them. Because you don't use American taxpayers' money to sustain some hopeless dictator, killing his own people and stealing the resources. Bottom line is that the World Bank must, in order to ensure that there is support for its own existence in the West, it must claim that there is success. One of the areas they picked to claim success was Uganda. They hipped Uganda as a success story. Now, if they withdraw today, the entire smoldering edifice will come tumbling down like a pack of cards. So, mutual dependence between the government of Uganda and the World Bank has led to mutual vulnerability. That is why the World Bank cannot pull out of Uganda. It needs to keep this appearance. The World Bank is also suffering from a disease I would call self-perpetuation. It has a vested interest in its own continued existence. Yes, sir.
My name is Ben. Can you comment on CNN reported this morning that President Museveni has signed a ceasefire with CONU, and they are working on a peace deal. And number two, given all the forces you're talking about, all the interchanges, can you give me a picture of us, let's say, 50 or 100 years
Projection. Let me tell you, if aid remains high and they double it as Blair has planned, you can, in the next 50 years, you can look forward to a continent mired in civil conflict, poverty, and indebtedness. If the Western world decides to say, okay, we are suspending all this thing called charity aid and things like that, governments take care of yourselves, in the next 50 to 100 years, you will see a prosperous Africa on the models of Europe and North America. Yes, sir.
My name is David. I came in a bit late, but my suspicion of guess is that the forum for this afternoon has been tied around three things: leadership, governance, and economic growth. In certain traditions in Africa, we know that leaders are born, because if you're from a certain clan, then you can rise to the chieftaincy. So we know where to shift blade when a particular clan or family is not doing well in governance. But looking at the political structures we have on the continent, leaders are made. And the question is, who makes them and what makes them? I've worked on university campuses with firebrand student leaders who speak and the whole world will shake. They move from campuses, go into government, and it is horrible. Now, all these three structures we're talking about, leadership, governance, and economic growth, are tied around structures. And some of these structures are so unsurmountable, maybe from our perspective. Now, since we are looking at solutions, someone is asking 50 years from now, how would Africa look? From your experience and all the travels you've done around and your observations, what structures do you think could serve as benchmarks or maybe blueprints which African governments could follow, which should promote good leadership, good governance, and good economic growth?
Thank you very much. Actually, I do not think that those structures are insurmountable. In fact, I do not even think that they are obdurate. They are not even hard. I have given you an example of the AIDS case in Uganda. Once there was political vulnerability, then the incentive to change culture. became important. Now, this is what I will end by saying, that what Africa needs, I cannot define what structures Africa will need to develop. Broadly, I can say it needs to have institutions and policies that support the success and prosperity of private enterprise. That's the most important. Have open access systems where people can trade and exchange. But what is important is to put in place the right incentives for governments to find it in their own interest to look for institutional innovations and policy innovations that favor growth. And the best way you can do that, you must make governments dependent on their own people for their own political survival. I cannot give you a solution for the countries that produce oil because those will certainly lag behind, but they will catch up when the countries that do not have resources begin developing and their citizens are getting better. There will be a catch-up effect. You can see that the growth of England and the lowlands and France, England, the lowlands and Germany was an incentive for countries nearing France and Germany, like Italy, to immediately catch up industrially, so they could not retain their old structures. The oil-producing countries of Africa will follow the example of those that are not endowed with rich minerals. The first thing you need to do, stop subsidizing these governments with money from abroad. Let every piece of coin count. Every expenditure at the government, if it has to borrow, let it borrow on commercial markets. I'm not against borrowing. Let it borrow domestically, let it borrow from international markets, but they must be markets. It should not get charity and subsidies from the World Bank and IMF. If it has to kill its own citizens, let it pay the price of trying to do that. So, unfortunately, this is the last question I'm answering. We have to go. Thank you very much for listening to me.
I will now call upon Dr. Tunde Adeleke, the advisor for the African Student Association, to say thank you to the speaker for today. But after the closing, then we can allow him, if he still allows to be here, for a few minutes to interact with you.
I want to thank you for an inspiring lecture and thought-provoking and controversial, and I think we owe it to the ISU Committee on Lectures and the African Student Association for making this possible. And we need this kind of dialogue amongst ourselves. It's an intellectual community. We don't always agree, but I do remember that listening to you so eloquently diagnose the problems and challenges of African countries and offers solutions reminds me a lot of very similar, very spirited discussions we had in the 70s, 80s in Nigeria, similar debates. And I think someone alluded to the fact that very often African scholars who are able to offer such, diagnoses, when they find themselves on the other side of the equation, often become silent. And I'm going to discuss that with you, later, how you stand. If you were on the other side, what your analysis would be. But I think we can continue these discussions after this. And I want to thank you all for your time and for coming. And please, Andrew is around to continue these discussions with us. Thank you all.
Do you want to continue?
I wanted to ask you another question, but I couldn't because I knew I would only be able to ask one.